I think has to be grounded in the realization that we're not talking about some civil liberties revolution, even in the best of all of our dreams. What we're talking about is a mild restoration of some of the most fundamental and basic precepts that just a short time ago weren't even really subject to debate, and yet now are under not just assault, but almost a complete elimination. And I think that whatever we talk about in terms of change needs to be based on that realization. To talk about what the specific candidates think about these issues is very difficult for one simple reason. Despite the centrality of all of these issues to most of the political controversies of the last 7 years, and I mean, if you look at the political controversies of the last 7 years, from torture to warrantless eavesdropping to detention without any cause to provocations of our country attacking other countries with no good reason, what you find are at the heart of that is the theories of presidential power that the Bush administration adopted in September and October of 2001 that basically vest the president with the type of monarchical power that this country was founded in order to avoid. And so you would think, if you were a minimally rational person, that as we attempt to decide who the next president would be, that we would be interested in knowing what those candidates thought about those theories of presidential power and those policies that have created so much, such a tumultuous change in our political landscape. And yet I defy any of you to go and find a television show where these presidential candidates have appeared, where they're asked about what they believe about the scope of presidential powers or whether the growing surveillance state ought to be curbed in any way. It simply is invisible by and large in our political landscape, and so I can stand before you as someone who reads about these issues and writes about them all the time, and my understanding of what the presidential candidates think about these issues is extremely sketchy because they never really are compelled to describe what it is that they believe in any way at all. So it's a difficult endeavor to do much other than speculate about what a John McCain presidency or a Barack Obama presidency would mean in terms of so many of these issues. There are some metrics, though, that you can evaluate in order to try and have some sense for what the answer to those questions might be. The easiest metric is probably also the most worthless and most unreliable, and that is, what do the candidates themselves say about what they think about these things and what they intend to do? I mean, I guess you can look at that and sort of figure out, but I think any person who observes our political culture wouldn't place much faith in that, but let's do that just briefly. There are a few commentators and journalists, some of whom are here as part of this conference, a small handful in America, who do write about these issues and have written about how radical and extreme and inconsequential these policies have been. And one of them is named Charlie Savage, and he was a reporter at the Boston Globe until last month when he went to the New York Times. And in January, or December rather, of 2007, Charlie Savage, while he was at the Boston Globe, he had just won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the president's use of signing statements as an instrument for evading the law, for placing himself above the law. And he wrote a questionnaire that had 10 questions and distributed them to all of the presidential candidates. There were something like 25 of them at the time, and it asked what their views are on things like warrantless eavesdropping and the U memorandum and the theory of unitary executive, and what the president's war powers are in terms of what he does and doesn't need in terms of congressional approval to start wars and deploy the military and the like. And most of the Republican field simply refused to answer, but John McCain did answer. And interestingly, in a lot of ways, McCain's answers were at odds with many of the Bush theories of executive power that have predominated over the last 7 years. McCain, for instance, said that he would never, under any circumstances, issue a signing statement for any reason, which is actually a fairly extreme view. I mean, even critics of the Bush administration think that signing statements have some role to play, or at least are legitimate for some purposes, but he said he would never issue signing statements. He said that the president never in any circumstance has the power to violate a statute, so that if the Congress passes a law saying that warrantless eavesdropping is criminal, the president actually is compelled to abide by that law, said McCain in this questionnaire. Over the last few weeks, however, the position of McCain on a lot of these issues has generated some controversy among the sort of authoritarian, far-right contingent of the Republican Party that has supported the Bush administration with regard to these policies. A couple of weeks ago, there was a surrogate of the McCain campaign who was at a conference and was asked about McCain's view on the pending FISA debate and whether or not the telecoms that enabled spying on their customers in violation of the law ought to be held accountable in a court of law, or whether they ought to be immunized from all liability. And the surrogate who was there to represent the McCain campaign said that McCain actually opposes telecom immunity in the absence of two conditions. One, that there be very probing hearings to find out what actually occurred in terms of these spying programs, things that we still are in the dark about almost completely. And two, that the telecoms acknowledge that what they did was illegal and apologize for it and vow never to do that again. That's what the McCain campaign surrogate said would be necessary in order for McCain to support the idea that telecoms should be immunized from liability. That was a very odd thing to say because only 2 months earlier, John McCain in the Senate had voted for the FISA bill that was written jointly by Jay Rockefeller, the Democratic senator and chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and Dick Cheney. And that FISA bill vastly expanded warrantless eavesdropping powers for the president and also provided unconditional immunity to the telecoms. And McCain not only voted for that bill, but he voted specifically for an amendment to keep telecom immunity in that bill without any of the conditions that his surrogate said would be necessary. And so this created this sort of mini controversy at places like National Review and Weekly Standard and the sort of neoconservative journals that support limitless government power and have done so for the last 7 years. And they sort of started protesting in the petulant, those sort of shrill and relentless way that characterizes that movement. And finally, the McCain campaign responded, and they wrote a memo to National Review, and in it they said, John McCain said, in essence, that he thinks the telecoms and the Bush administration did absolutely nothing wrong when they spied on Americans without warrants of any kind, and that as president, he also, just like the Bush administration, would invoke his Article 2 powers in order to defend the country, which is code for the president can violate the law when it comes to national security, and said that he fully and unconditionally favors telecom amnesty. It was a full-fledged embrace of the very theories of radical theories of executive power that only 6 months ago, when he was in the middle of a primary and trying to maintain his maverick credentials, he said that he rejected. So even with regard to the easiest metric, which is what do they say about what they believe about these issues, with regard to John McCain, I just simply can't tell you. Because what he said this week, literally, is the diametric opposite of what he said 6 months ago. It's possible that he has no beliefs on these issues, and it's possible that he's willing to shift with regard to those matters whenever doing so is politically expedient. Barack Obama is a somewhat different case in that, by and large, he has paid lip service to the idea that things like the rule of law means that the president can't act in violation of the law. He has voted against and spoken out on things like warrantless eavesdropping, telecom immunity, the Military Commissions Act, all of which John McCain supported and voted for. But at the same time, the rhetorical record of Obama is not really matched by very much in the way of meaningful action. He's never taken any role in the Senate to do things like restoring habeas corpus or eliminating some of these draconian spying provisions or curbing the surveillance state in any way. And so while his record rhetorically is much cleaner and more consistent and more encouraging, I suppose one could say, than McCain's is, there isn't very much action to suggest that there's any authenticity or passion behind those convictions. And so I think there, too, there's a big question mark with regard to what a Barack Obama administration would mean for any of these civil liberties and constitutional questions. And then, of course, there's third-party candidates or alternative candidates, such as Congressman Barr, who we talked about earlier, whose record matches his rhetoric in many ways, in that he was one of the earliest proponents of trying to put as many limits as possible in the Patriot Act.